Okay. Well, welcome everybody to this Green Talk seminar here at the OECD. Today's topic is moving towards mainstreaming, OECD perspectives on biodiversity ahead of CBD COP13. As I'm sure you all know, more than 190 parties to the Convention on Biological Diversity will be meeting in Cancun, Mexico next week to talk about biodiversity, the Earth's natural resources. The overarching theme this year's COP is mainstreaming biodiversity for human well-being. And it's my pleasure to welcome Katia Karousakis, who leads the biodiversity work here at the OECD, to talk about mainstreaming biodiversity, what it means, and how we are going about it. Katia.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you everyone who's here today, and hopefully who's also logging in via the computer system. As Simon said, I'll be speaking today about moving towards mainstreaming. And basically, next slide, please. I'll be covering three issues. First of all, I'll just start with why is biodiversity important. I think people have different perspectives of what biodiversity is. And apparently, many people, according to different surveys, don't really understand what biodiversity is in its full context. Then I'll be going on to describe a little bit about what the Convention on Biological Diversity is and the importance of COP13, including on what mainstreaming biodiversity means. And then I'll finish off by highlighting some insights and perspectives from the OECD. As you may know, the OECD is a sort of a policy-based, economics-based organization. We have a number of different directorates here: environment, agriculture, fisheries, development cooperation. So I'll be drawing on information from around the house that relates to mainstreaming biodiversity for today. So on that note, first of all, what is biodiversity? And biodiversity is life on Earth. Think about the different species. Think about the documentaries from David Attenborough, the lions, the tigers, the little insects under the soil, et cetera, et cetera. So those are sort of the animals. But you also want to think about the different ecosystems. So forests, oceans, wetlands, meadows, anything that you can imagine where you're breathing fresh air, for example, think of that as sort of your natural ecosystems. And then it's also about all the interactions between these different things. But I'd also like to highlight that it's not just about the plants and the species. It's also the wood, the water that we drink, the table here in front of me, the water, if you can see it here, for example. It's used in all of the different bits and pieces of our everyday lives, in part of our economy's production, patterns, and in the things that we consume. So basically, biodiversity is not just about little birds and the bees. Think of it, it's pretty much everything, and if you'd like to think of it like that. And now turning to some of the indicators on where we are today with regard to biodiversity. Now, because biodiversity encompasses so many different things, because of the various complexities from the various ecosystems, et cetera, it's very difficult to come up with one indicator for biodiversity. So different organizations have developed several different types, whether it's threatened species, whether it's overexploitation of fisheries. Here, what I'm presenting here is a slide on global terrestrial mean species abundance. So the sort of the average species, and this is at the global level. It's based on the OECD Environmental Outlook to 2050. And we see that based on the pristine, if you think of mean species abundance at 100% as a sort of intact ecosystem and 100% species at that point, by 1970, we had lost about a third of our mean species abundance. Today, we're at around 67%. And we're projected to lose another 10% by 2050. So this is an indicator for terrestrial, at the terrestrial level. I'm going to turn now to another indicator that's available also at the global level, which is from the FAO, which look at global trends in the state of world marine fish stocks. And we see here that today, or according to the latest data, nearly 1/3 of our marine fish stock is overexploited, and more than 1/2 of it is fully exploited. And you see the trends here from 1974 to 2013. So these are just some available indicators. There are other ones as well. You can look at the Global Biodiversity Outlook as well, prepared under, which looks at some other ones. Now, just also highlight, why is this important? So think about the biodiversity, the ecosystems. These different sort of natural environments, they provide services that are crucial for us, for our human well-being. Some examples here are pollination, water and nutrient cycling, natural hazard protection, soil stabilization, climate regulation, and a number of other ones. These are, I think, also even more difficult to comprehend in our sort of our daily lives. But the point is that they provide vast benefits to us. For example, the economic value of pollination services by insect pollinators has been estimated at $192 billion per year. Looking at, for example, the value that coral reefs, one of our most threatened ecosystems, if you like, at the present time, in terms of the decline in healthy coral reef. The value of coral reef for fisheries, for coastal protection, for tourism, has been estimated at around $30 billion a year. So if you add up a number of these different estimates that are available, obviously the data overall is not available for all the different ecosystem services, but we do know that the costs to our society are high. And overall, that the pressures as well, which is what I'm going to go to here, the pressures on our biodiversity are also very high and are in many cases also projected to increase. So looking here first on terrestrial biodiversity on the left-hand side and marine biodiversity on the right-hand side, these are the different types of key pressures on our ecosystems today. So in terms of terrestrial biodiversity, we have land use change and management is one of the key pressures at the moment on our terrestrial biodiversity. We have overexploitation of natural resources. And then turning specifically to the marine biodiversity, some of the key pressures are overfishing, as I had indicated in the slide before. Habitat destruction as well, also in the marine environment. And then three other key drivers or key pressures on our ecosystems, which affect both terrestrial and marine biodiversity, are pollution, climate change, and also invasive alien species. And just in terms of some of the numbers that are available today, I'll just pick the example of habitat degradation in the marine environment. It's been estimated that 60% of the world's major marine ecosystems have been degraded or are being used unsustainably today. Moreover, an estimated 20% of global mangroves have been lost, and 19% of coral reefs have disappeared since the 1980s. So these are not good things overall. And turning now to what the Convention on Biological Diversity is, before you read the text here, just the overarching three objectives of the Convention on Biological Diversity are first, to conserve biodiversity, second, to sustainably use the components of biological diversity, and third, to ensure the fair and equitable sharing of benefits arising from the genetic resources. In 2010, the parties to the Convention on Biological Diversity, the more than 190, I think 196 or 7 parties got together and established new targets for the Aichi biodiversity targets, which range from 2011 to 2020. They're composed of 5 goals, the goals you can see listed here, as well as 20 targets. So I'm just going to read a couple of these. Goal A, for example, is to address the underlying causes of biodiversity loss by mainstreaming biodiversity across government and society. And I'll touch a little bit upon what mainstreaming means in a sense. Goal B is to reduce the direct pressures on biodiversity. Goal C is to safeguard, so restore and protect, promote biodiversity. And you have the other two goals there. And what does this mean a little bit more concretely in practice with regards that's fleshed out in more detail in the 20 different targets? I'm obviously not going to go through all of the targets. I've just highlighted a couple here to give you a sense of where the international community is trying to go by 2020. So, for example, target 3 is that incentives, so policy incentives, for example, including subsidies that are harmful to biodiversity, are eliminated, phased out, or reformed, and that positive incentives for the conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity are developed and applied. Then there are also some more targets that are more quantitative in nature, such as target 5, which is that the rate of loss of all natural habitats, including forests, for example, is at least halved. We have targets on protected areas, both terrestrial protected areas and marine protected areas. So the goal that we reach 17% of terrestrial and inland protected areas by 2020, and 10% of coastal and marine areas by 2020. And the final target, just again here as an example, is the need to scale up finance for biodiversity so that we can help achieve all these different goals. Just to highlight a little bit more in terms of the context of mainstreaming, and that's, as I had indicated earlier, that's the main theme this year of the Convention on Biological Diversity. And I think that part of the reason why mainstreaming has been selected as the theme is that we are sort of today in the midpoint between when these targets were developed in 2010 and when the end goal is. So it's a period where we're really looking to see how far have we come so far and where do we need to go in the next, 4 years really. And I think there's also a need to indicate to the wider community that mainstreaming, the importance of mainstreaming biodiversity. In other words, it's not something only that environment ministries can address by themselves, given that there are all these different sectors that impact on biodiversity, but they would really need to work together across different sectors, across different levels of society, for people to sort of wake up to the importance and to the values that these natural resources and these ecosystems bring to our economies as a whole, and they need to sort of work together as a whole. So I think it's a way also to promote awareness and a call for action from a wider number of constituencies, if you like. I'll turn now to a little bit about what we do here at the OECD and how it relates to mainstreaming, and I'll draw also upon some of the data that we have here, which help to track trends towards mainstreaming across different sectors. So first of all, just a quick look at what can we do? What's the toolbox, if you like, for governments to provide incentives for better, more efficient use of our resources, and hence to drive down these pressures on biodiversity. There are, for example, regulatory instruments, also referred to as command and control approaches. These economic instruments, which are able to also raise revenue, and they provide specific incentives, for example, to the private sector or to landowners, etc., which give them also more flexibility to be more cost-effective in how they react to these incentives, and also information and voluntary approaches. So this is, in a sense, sort of a snapshot of the different policy instruments that are available. Some are based on the polluter pays approach, such as taxes, charges, and fees. Others are based on the beneficiary pays approach, such as payments for ecosystem services, etc. anyway, I'm going to stop there with this particular slide, but the point is that these are the types of policy instruments that governments can introduce, which will also have incentives then on the private sector and on our behavior as consumers in terms of our consumption patterns. So I'm just going to go through a selection of some of the things of the data that we collect here, which do relate to mainstreaming as well, and which help to track trends towards mainstreaming. First of all, we have a policy instrument for the environment database, which looks at the number of different policy instruments that governments are applying, including for biodiversity. So they include things like taxes, charges, tradable permits, and other instruments. We also have data here on government support to agriculture, also government support to fisheries, and we also track data on bilateral biodiversity-related development finance, which is part of the real markers. So I'm just going to provide a short overview of some of the data we have here, which help to indicate the extent to which we're mainstreaming or not. Or some are snapshots in one period of time, others are trends. So here you see, for example, the revenue across a number of different countries from environmentally related taxes. So these are instruments that when a particular method of production has adverse impacts on the environment, including on biodiversity, for example, they help to provide incentives to reduce that. And you see here that most of the environmentally related taxes across OECD countries are applied to energy, which is the blue coloring at the top. Somewhat so environmentally related taxes related to motor vehicles and transport. And the small fraction at the very top, which is the green, that's on the top one, which you can't see, but I mean, that's an indication of it's not very much, is the other. This is the other that also relates to the ones that are biodiversity relevant. Covers a few things, but these are the ones that are also most biodiversity relevant. And I would just like to highlight here that in total, the total revenue from environmentally relevant taxes is about $785 billion for the year 2014, and of that, around $2 billion of this approximately is from biodiversity relevant taxes. So it's a very, very small fraction of that. And hopefully also this indicates a potential to scale it up. If possible, it would be a good thing. Turning to agricultural support, we track data here on government support to farmers. That's in the Producer Support Estimate database. And here we have data shown from 1990 to 2015. Today, at present, government support to agriculture is around more than $200 billion a year. That's the blue, the green, and the gray on the right-hand side of the figure. Based on different categories, you can classify these as potentially most environmentally harmful, potentially least harmful, and other. The green is the least harmful, and we see here that from the 1990s, the potentially most environmentally harmful subsidies have decreased from more than 75% to now slightly below 50%. So we're seeing positive trends over time. But nevertheless, the least harmful or even potentially beneficial support to agriculture is only today at 7%. So it's still a small fraction. So we're improving over time, but the ones that can be potentially environmentally beneficial are still a small fraction of agricultural support. Then turning to fisheries support, we have data here from 19 countries, and we see support in terms of general services and transfers to individual fishers. This is a snapshot. It's 2012 data, there's ongoing work now at the OECD to increase the number of countries that are reporting to this database and to provide it over time as well. So finally, I'd like to look at another indication of where we are towards mainstreaming biodiversity, but in the context of official development assistance. These are brand new numbers as well. I think only presented yesterday, made available yesterday. And we have here the principal and significant amount of ODA for biodiversity. What principal means is that the ODA has been specifically given for the purpose of biodiversity. So the objectives of this ODA is targeting one of the three objectives of the convention. What significant means is that it's not primarily given for that purpose, but it also has benefits for biodiversity. So we see here the trends over time. So today, bilateral biodiversity-related ODA has reached around $8.7 billion per year, and it represents around 6% of the total bilateral ODA commitments. So we can see that trend over time as well. So these are just some of the indications of data that we have here at least, and that provide sort of indicators towards mainstreaming in general. So the question, going back to, are we moving towards mainstreaming biodiversity? I would say that, well, based on this data, but I'm going to also take a more broader picture in general. I think we are moving towards mainstreaming biodiversity, but we're moving at a relatively slow pace. There's also wide variations across countries. So in some countries, we're moving faster than others. In some countries, they're moving in certain areas faster versus not in others. But overall, if we are to achieve the targets for the biodiversity targets for 2020, we certainly need more ambitious policies, more widespread policies, and also more cost-effective policies. Unfortunately, the amounts of resources and finance that are often allocated to biodiversity in our national budgets is not very specifically large. So it's also important to make sure that where we're spending our biodiversity finance can achieve the greatest possible benefits with the limited resources that are often available to us. So thanks. I'll stop there. I just want to highlight that we'll be at the CBD COP starting next week. We'll be having 3 side events there on mainstreaming biodiversity, on development finance, and on biotechnology. And we'll be presenting at 4 other side events as well. So if you're there, please do come and join us. This is our website and just a very small selection of some of the material we have that relate to biodiversity, including biodiversity mainstreaming. Thank you.
Oh, thanks very much, Katia. And now the floor is open, or the air is open for questions. So I'm not one of those lucky enough to be going to Cancun. Simon Buckle, my colleague, is. I have to be in Melbourne to talk about nitrogen instead, which is a major threat to biodiversity through enrichment of waters, and it's a real scourge. But Katia.
Well, open to the floor.
Yes. The Tom.
Thank you, Katia. Thank you very much for this clear and concise presentation. I think it's refreshing our minds, and even if we know some of these aspects, it's good to have them presented like that. I have a question on with your experience with your past experience and current experience with the CBD, so which is a product basically from the United Nations in this umbrella. How is the work that you've presented from OECD perceived? Is it something that is taken into account, that is called for, that is guiding your own research? Could you elaborate on that? Thank you.
Sure. Thank you very much for that question. So I think I wasn't here at that time, but I think the OECD work on biodiversity started back in 1993, and it's always sort of focused on the economics aspects of biodiversity, and it's been supporting the CBD, I think, from the very beginning. I think the economic aspects of biodiversity has been gaining traction, and in fact also Target 3. So when I say the economic aspects, it's also the policies and how you implement those policies and how you also try and make them more cost effective. And actually Target 3, which I had highlighted before on one of the slides, which looks at removing, reforming harmful subsidies and providing incentives to enhance biodiversity. That was a very new target that hadn't been included in the biodiversity targets that for 2010. So I think these issues are becoming more and more important. You also see a number of other organizations now bringing in the economic elements to try and make the case also to finance ministries, to the agriculture. Why is it important? Why should we care? Well, because it also imposes costs on us, etc. So I think it's gaining prominence. In terms of does it guide our work at the OECD, I would say yes, it does. Yeah, I would say it certainly does. Also, with the delegates that we work here, they're obviously aware of the Convention on Biological Diversity. They're parties to it, and they want us to work on things that also feed into that.
I have a question on the oceans. As I don't know whether I have the right figures, but 1/3 of the Earth's surface is terrestrial, 2/3 is oceans, something along those lines. Well, so that doesn't mean, of course, that 2/3 of all our biodiversity is on oceans. But coming to the issue of mainstreaming and mainstreaming biodiversity aspects in other policies. In my previous life, I had the privilege to be a national delegate for the CBD for quite a while. And I was always struck by the fact that when you look to the CBD toolbox, specifically when it comes to marine and coastal areas, that toolbox is relatively empty. So when you want to do mainstreaming, a lot of effort is needed to push, let's say, other toolboxes, other conventions, other regulatory frameworks, etc., to take this mainstreaming really into account. What is the state of debate under the CBD next week? Because is there really only a focus, let's say, on what is under the CBD, or is there really that wider perspective that you look to all, let's say, other regulatory frameworks, other instruments that you cannot find in the CBD convention? I'm sorry to say, but that's at least my understanding from some years working as a humble national delegate under that convention. Thank you.
I would say that the CBD also adequately covers the life under the sea, if you like. There are different targets that relate to pollution also in the oceans. If you look through the 20 targets, I would say at least 4 or 5 of them at least relate to oceans and water, so maybe even more than that. And a number of the other targets are general ones that to me would apply universally on terrestrial or marine ecosystems. I think right now there is also actually, I think overall oceans is gaining a lot of attention. Maybe one part of the reason for that is when you look also at the Sustainable Development Goals, 2 out of the 17 targets are biodiversity related, 1 on terrestrial and 1 on the oceans. And in fact, many of the the actual targets under the Sustainable Development Goals for terrestrial and marine come from the CBD. So they've sort of, I mean, obviously you want some kind of consistency. So I think overall that's also a very good thing. And because of there is this target now, for example, on protected areas for marine and coastal areas, there's been a lot of impetus from governments to try and increase the coverage of their protected areas. But that's just one element. I mean, there are others. So I think there's been quite a bit of historical work on that. But obviously, yes, there are also other conventions that focus on oceans, different organizations working in different areas.
I had a question on the slide around the revenue from environmentally related taxes, and I noticed that in a lot of countries, the total revenue had reduced a lot from 2014 to 1995, and I wondered if that was because the tax levels were reduced, or whether it was because we were consuming less environmentally harmful products.
I would have to go to the experts who actually collect that data to ask them what their views are, and I don't see anyone here from there. It could also be that they haven't changed the level of the taxes, or that they haven't, adjusted for inflation. There could be different reasons. The thing is, for the biodiversity relevant taxes, at least, that's also something that we've done just now. So it's interesting to see what that data shows. We've gone through all the instruments and tagged them as to whether or not they're biodiversity relevant. Yes, I cannot answer your question for sure.
Okay, we've got 3 questions on the screen. Katia, would you like to take us through those? One from Teresa, one from Vic Wyman. I can't see the name of the third one.
Sure, yes, I will read them out. So the first question says, I would like to ask about the environmentally related taxes. My understanding is that the taxation as such is a motivation to act as to avoid the payment. Nevertheless, are these resources collected as the environmentally related taxes used by governments to support biodiversity and ecosystems? Okay, so what these environmentally related taxes do is, so imagine that you're a company and you're polluting into the environment. There's then a tax on that level of pollution. It can be different types of things. And hence then the company has an incentive, either they're just going to pay the tax, and the tax normally goes to the government coffers, unless it's earmarked, but I'll go back to that point. So the company can either pay the tax, or because it's now an additional cost, they can introduce other sort of abatement measures to try and reduce their pollution. And because they have this flexibility, it's a least cost option. I mean, it's a more efficient way to try and address pollution from the company. Now, going back to where does the money go? I would say in most cases, so already though you're providing an incentive to the company to reduce its pollution. So that's a good thing. Then the second question is, where does the money go? In many cases, the revenue from these environmentally related taxes goes to government coffers. But in other cases, they're earmarked, so then some fraction of the money, or all of the money, depending on where you're placing the environmentally related tax, is used for environmental purposes. I'm just going to give a very simple example. It's not an environmentally related tax, but it's a sort of user fee. For example, when you go into a national park, in many countries, there are entrance fees that are charged. Or tourists, when they fly to a number of different countries, Belize, Chile, etc., there's an international tourist tax. And in some cases, these are earmarked so that the money from those taxes goes back to the national parks themselves to help with the monitoring, the management, the enforcement, etc., which is also very important, because without that sort of money, you can't actually, you might have a paper park, but you're not actually managing it properly. So that's the one question. Yes. The second question is, how is Europe doing on the CBD goals and targets? What regulation and economic instrument changes are needed in Europe? So we have, I would say, so Europe, I think it depends. There's so many goals. There's so many targets. I think it depends on what you look at. But overall, I think Europe is, compared to other countries as a whole, they have a number of economic instruments in place, a number of regulations in place, it depends. It really depends, I think, on the specifics of what particular elements that you're looking at. We have a number of cases where you can find good practice insights from Europe. In other cases, you find wonderful examples from a number of other countries. So it's very case specific. The third question is, how can architecture and building industry contribute to biodiversity from your point of view? That's a difficult question for me. I know there's work on green infrastructure. I think here at the OECD at least, I mean, there are different types of standards that you can put in place. I think much of the work, at least here, maybe is focusing on also looking at energy efficiency and greenhouse gas emissions. And these are also beneficial sort of indirectly to biodiversity because climate change leads to biodiversity loss as well. Simon, do you have a... No? Okay. Oh, you have a question. Okay. But to be honest, we haven't here at the OECD, at least we've not done work on greening infrastructure with a strong emphasis on biodiversity, I would say. And my supervisors can correct me if I'm wrong. The other question is, how can the OECD better improve and force national governments to follow a more sustainable management of environmental resources? Yeah, that covers, it's true. It covers a number of different things. Again, there are various streams at the OECD also working on anti-corruption, on different elements. Overall, I mean, what we do here, let me go back and try and tie it more into also our biodiversity work. One of the key sort of design and implementation features across a number of, well, all policy instruments, I would say, is the need to enforce is put it, so monitor, report, verify, and then do compliance and enforcement. So whether we're looking at payments for ecosystem services, for biodiversity offsets, we have various publications on these things. We try and highlight good practice from across these different countries on how to better enforce. There's a graduated enforcement. If you're a first time doing something bad, maybe the penalty is slightly lower, but as you know, if you're second time, third time, the penalties can increase depending on how damaging the result is. Again, you can increase the fines, etc. There's another area of work that we have here. Again, this is not biodiversity specific, but we do have the environmental performance reviews, which are country-specific studies that are undertaken on a regular basis. And in those studies, the OECD teams look at how the countries are doing based on their own environmental objectives, whether it's green growth, whether it's climate, biodiversity, waste, etc. So for those types of studies, we look at how the countries are doing themselves and also drawing on good practices from other countries to provide targeted recommendations for how they can address some of the different issues they have.
Katia, can I ask you a nice, easy question, which follows on from that? It's interesting that both the questioners and yourself started with biodiversity and ended up in very general areas of environmental policy, which are all encompassing. And of course, well, I was just going to say that you said that's mainstreaming, but this is one of the problems, it seems to me, for delegates going to a conference which has talked about mainstreaming for biodiversity, because in a sense, biodiversity relies on the life-supporting capacity of the planet's resources and the way we interfere with them. And that's just about everything. And so I'd just like you to tell me, it's very easy to make the case for doing a good job about managing all resources sustainably, but if policymakers are being asked to focus on biodiversity, is there anything you can say about how you would prioritize your policy so that it was particularly tuned to biodiversity? Because unfortunately, I think with a lot of the public, biodiversity is sort of visible living things, and quite often big things, like we can see out the window, trees and so on. We can't see any leopards from here. But there's a vast amount of life-supporting stuff in the soils, in water quality and so on. How do you make that link between the big picture and biodiversity for policymakers? Have you given that much thought?
Oh, thank you for that question. I think one of the problems, or the downfalls of this terminology biodiversity, is that people tend to think small, whereas I think it is so much more than that. And it is also very complex. There's, as I said, so many different elements, so many different possible indicators. So it's very difficult to be able to say, this is what you should do or this is what you should do. But, for example, economic valuation helps you sort of put things in one unit that is comparable with other things. We have information, and information is improving on what are if you're only going to look at it in terms of biodiversity in the smaller sense, what are the key areas of biodiversity, where are the highest benefits of biodiversity. I think there's now more and more effort to try and also put these values on the ecosystem services, and so we have a lot of local examples, a few studies that have looked at certain ecosystem services at the global level, and I think the more we build up this information base, we can use that information to make much more informed policy decisions, including for prioritization. So I think we already have enough information to make good decisions in terms of prioritizing, and there's a general sort of formula in terms of where you would want to focus your efforts. First is, where are your highest benefits? The second is, where are the highest threats? Because, I mean, if you're in a wonderful, pristine area where there's no one there anyway and there's no harm being done to it, there's no point in running off to try and protect that. So where are your most threatened areas and most threatened, ecosystems? And then if you have two areas that one has the same high benefits, that's the same risk of loss, but you only have a small amount of money, where do I go? Where should I spend my money on? Where are the lowest opportunity costs? Where would it be cheaper for me, more cost effective, to achieve this higher biodiversity benefit, address the loss? So you would target your resources there first, and then if you have more money, more resources, you can then also start allocating your efforts to these other areas. Ideally, we would have enough resources to reach this balance of sustainability, so that we're not, so you're having your optimal levels of resource use, as opposed to what we have today, which, I mean, we're going beyond the limits in a sense of our sustainability.
Thanks. It's an excellent answer. Thank you very much. One more here? Yes.
Just following on from that, actually, my understanding is, and correct me if I'm wrong, many of the most threatened areas for biodiversity are actually in countries that are not OECD members. So how do you think about our work on biodiversity going forward and trying to target some of the issues that are more relevant? I mean, if we're talking about biodiversity at a global level, the really big issues, how can we really target some of the areas in countries that are not our members? Slowly, but how going forward?
Thank you for that question. So CBD, that's okay. That's one possible answer. I mean, we also have development cooperation. So these are efforts that you can provide support to other countries where they need that support, whether it's capacity building, financial, etc., otherwise to address the biodiversity hotspots. You're looking though at, for example, at the megadiverse countries, and there are 17, megadiverse, the countries with the most biodiversity overall. And these include both developed and developing countries. Moreover, the ecosystem services that we get from our ecosystems, they're not only global, but we obtain them at the local level as well. So obviously we need efforts here. We need efforts everywhere. And also looking at in terms of our consumption patterns and the amount of resources that we consume in different countries, these also vary substantially. So I think this is perhaps an easy answer, but I think you need a balance as well as to making sure you're able to still conserve these emblematic, maybe when you're thinking about biodiversity in the hotspots, many are in further away places to where we are, at least here today. But ecosystem services are important everywhere, and we all sort of need to take the right steps to address our footprints.
Great. I can't see any more questions on the screen. Are there any more questions in the room? If not, I think we should all thank Katia for an excellent, clear presentation and generous response to questions. So thank you, Katia, very much.
Thank you.